Hey gang, and welcome to week 3 of Code Club. This week we're going to talk about operators, sensing, some advanced looping, and if tests. Open up another browser window and log on to Scratch so that you can follow along. Have fun and let's start coding. Last week when I was going through all the different code categories, I was kind of doing them in order. This week I'm going to skip a little bit and do operators before I do sensing, and that's just because understanding how operators work makes understanding how sensing works a little bit easier. Operator blocks are used to take data from your program and manipulate it in such a way that it produces a new value. For example, multiplying two numbers together and using the result of that somewhere else in your program is using an operator. There are two types of operator blocks available in Scratch: reporter blocks and Boolean blocks. Reporter blocks have these rounded edges, and they're used to calculate values that can be used in place of variables. So for example, I have an add block here. It's got a plus sign. I can put two numbers in here, and it will always return the value, which in this case is 9. Boolean blocks have these triangle-shaped edges, and they're used to always return either true or false. So if you look here, it's got a greater than sign. So what this is going to do is test if whatever I put in here is greater than 50. So I put 199 in there that is greater than 50, it's going to return true. If I put 1 in there that's less than 50, it's going to return false. So all of these ones with the triangle sides, which are Boolean operators, return either true or false every time. Because they only ever return true or false, the Boolean blocks let you make decisions in your program. I'm going to show you a quick example real quick just of how that works, and then later on we'll look at the code behind this. So I'm going to start my program. It asks how old am I. I'm going to put 1, and it shows me that I'm a baby. I'm going to run it again, and I'll put that I'm 10, and it shows that I'm a kid. I'll run it again, say I'm 13, and that shows I'm a teenager. And if I run it again and put that I'm 40, it shows I'm a dinosaur. So just ScratchCAD asks me how old I am, and just based on the input that I give, it uses the Boolean operators to choose the proper image to display. If we switch back to the code and go to the sensing blocks real quick, you can see why I wanted to talk about operators first, because many of the blocks in sensing are actually Boolean or reporting, and so it's easier to understand how to use these if we know how to use operators. Let's switch back to the operators and we'll quickly walk through what each of them does. So these top ones, plus, minus, multiply, divide, are all fairly easy. Say 10 plus 5 gives 15. Say 10 minus 5 gives 5. 10 times 5 gives 50. 10 divided by 5 gives 2. The pick random is also easy. You just give it two numbers, and here it says between 1 and 10, and it gives us a random number every time it runs. And you can put whatever two numbers you want in here. Let's say 4 and 4,544. So now it's going to give us bigger numbers as it goes through and picks random numbers. The ones down here operate on strings, which are groups of text together. So the first one is called join, and it puts two strings together. So right here I have join Mr. and Beachy, and when I click on it, it says Mr. Beachy. The one thing you need to watch out for is if you notice at the end of this, maybe it's hard to see, but there's a space at the end of Mr. If I were to take that out of there, when he says it, it joins it together into one. So you need to remember to put a space at the end of it if it's something where you need to have a space between two words. The letter of operator looks at a string and finds whatever text is at that exact position in the string. So for this one, it says letter 5 of Mr. Beachy. And if we count it out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have to include that space. It's going to be the B. And if we run it, it returns B. So, like I said, this can be, if I put letter 4 here, that's the letter right before the B, which is a space, it's just going to print a space out up here. So you need to be careful when you're counting your letters and your strings that you always include the punctuation and the spaces. The length of operator gives you a count of how many characters are in your string. So, for example, how many are in Mr. Beachy, and similarly to the letter of operator, it includes any punctuation or spaces that you have. So if I run this, it says there's 10 characters in the string Mr. Beachy. This group of operators at the bottom, I'll do some advanced math. So we'll do the easy one first, which is round, and right here it says round 23.5, and if I run it, it says 24, because 23.5 rounds up, and that gives us 24. If it were to be 23.3, that would round down and show 23. The modulo operator does a division and then returns the remainder of the division that was done, but it throws away the actual result. If there is no remainder, the mod operator just returns 0. Let's look at it run real quick. So I have 5 mod 2, so it's going to divide 5 by 2 and return the remainder, which should be 1. Now let's do 6 mod 2. 6 divided by 2 does not have a remainder, so it returns 0. There's a lot of different ways advanced programmers use the modulo operator, but probably the most popular one, and luckily for us the easiest to understand, is to test whether a number is even or odd. And the reason for this is, whenever you divide a number by 2, if the number is even, the remainder is always going to be 0. If the number is odd, the remainder is always going to be 1. It's a real quick way to test whether your number is odd or even. This last reporter operator gives us a dropdown with many different advanced mathematical operators in it. For example, an absolute value, a floor, which means always rounding down, a ceiling, which means always rounding up, a square root. There's a bunch of them in here. I'm just going to do the square root one real quick because that's the easiest one for people to understand. For example, the square root of 9 is 3. If I run this, it gives me the square root, which is 3. Before we talk about the Boolean operator blocks, we need to talk about a concept called if tests, which is where you wind up using the Boolean blocks the most. If we go back into the control category, we can see there's blocks called if then and if then else. And you can see they have this triangle-sided operator looking thing in there, and that's where we pull the Boolean operators into. The way if tests work is you put a Boolean operator in here, and then it says if this Boolean operator is true, then run this section of code. An if then else says if this Boolean operator is true, then run this section of code. If it's false, then run this section of code. Either way, if it doesn't run or it runs, it will always run any code that you have attached at the bottom. And same here, whether the if runs or the else runs, it'll always run whatever code you have attached at the bottom. Now that we know what to do with the Boolean operators, we can go back into the operators section and look at them. And we see that there's some simple ones, greater than, less than, or equal, which all work exactly like they would in math class. There's also another simple one for string, which is whether a string contains another string. So this one says apple contains A. If apple contains the letter A, it's going to return true. You can also do this for full strings in here. So you can say apple contains AP, and that would return true if apple contains AP, or false if it, if I type AJ in here, there's no AJ in apple, so that's going to return false. I set up a couple of real simple examples. So this one is a greater than. It says if a random number between 3 and 7 is greater than 5, say big number for 2 seconds. And then either way, it's going to display after if. So we run it. All it said is after if, so that means it didn't pick a big number. Run it again. This time it picked a big number, and then it said after if. The next example is for the equals operator, and it's whether a random number between 49 and 51 is equal to 50. So if I run it, it chose 50 the first time, so it displayed 50, and then after if else. If I run it again, it shows a number that isn't 50, so it displayed not 50, and then after if else. So this shows you how to use the if else block. This example shows the string contains operator. So right now it says if Mr. Beachy contains bat, then say Mr. B, else say not Mr. B. So I run it. Mr. Beachy contains bat, so it says Mr. B. Now if I change this to be Mr. Smith does not contain bat, so it says not Mr. B. This other set of 3 operators, and, or, and not, allow you to group multiple Boolean operators together. The AND operator lets you put 2 more Boolean operators inside of it. And what AND means is that both sides of the AND have to be true in order for the AND to be true. So, if you look at the example here, I have 51 greater than 50 and apple contains A. If both of these are true, then it's going to say hello for 2 seconds. If I change either one of these to be false, so 40 is not greater than 50, so this one's going to be false, it's not going to run. You change this back so it's bigger, and then I'll make this one false. Apple does not contain B, so that is also not going to run. If I change it back to A, then it runs. So for an AND to work, both sides of the AND operator have to be true. To use the OR operator, you also put 2 Boolean operators within it. But this time, only one of them has to be true. They can both be, and that will still make the OR true. But only one of them has to be. So right now they're both true. 51 is greater than 50 and apple contains A. It's going to say hello. If I change this so 40 is greater than 50, that's false, but apple still contains A, so the OR returns true and that says hello. If I change this so apple contains B, now they're both going to be false. That means the OR is going to return false and it's not going to say hello. So they can either both be true or one or the other can be true, and then my OR will be true and my code inside my if test will run. But if they're both false, then my code inside my if test will not run. The NOT operator lets you put one Boolean operator into it, and it just takes the opposite of whatever that Boolean says. So right now I have 50 equal 50 inside this NOT operator. 50 equal 50 would result in true. This says not true, which is going to be false. That means this if test is going to result to false, and it's not going to say hello. If I change this to be 51, 51 is not equal to 50, so this one is going to be false. Not false is true, so this is going to return true. So the NOT operator just returns the opposite of whatever the operator inside of it is. Another powerful part about AND, OR, and NOT is that you can put them inside of each other. So for example, I can put an AND inside my OR and then put other operators inside of there and make really big, messy looking if tests, but they're super powerful for making your code do what you want it to do. If we go back and look in the control section real quick, you can see there's a couple of other looping operators that use Booleans in them. So there's wait until, which instead of wait for a certain number of seconds, you can say wait until something happens that results in true. Or rather than repeating for a certain number of times or repeating forever, you can say repeat until some Boolean operator returns true. Now that we have all that out of the way, we can finally start talking about the sensing blocks. And I'm going to start with talking about the Boolean sensing blocks. Those are the ones that have the triangle sides. The first one is the one that says if touching, and it's got a drop down, and you can say if touching mouse pointer, if touching the edge, or if touching another sprite if you have other sprites. And I have two on here just so I can show you that that's an option. And the way it works is I'm going to start my code up here, and right now I have it set to touching mouse pointer. My mouse pointer is not touching Scratchcat, so it's not doing anything. But as soon as I go and touch Scratchcat, it says hello. I go away from him again and it stops saying hello. And I go back on it and he says hello again. So it just detects if it's touching something else, and then if it is, it does something. The other thing you'll notice is I have the if test inside a forever loop, and that way it keeps running this if test over and over again while my code is running. Otherwise it would just run once and you wouldn't be able to see the results of it because it would only run the if test once, and if I wasn't touching the mouse pointer right at that time, you wouldn't see it. For the touching color example, for this you can open this up and select a color this way, or use this medicine dropper to choose a color from over here. And then all it does is if your sprite is touching a certain color, it will do what's inside your if test, otherwise it won't. So let me start the code running. Since my backdrop is this green color, it keeps saying hello over and over again. If I go back and change my backdrop real quick to just be a plain white backdrop, now when I run my code, he never says hello because the Scratchcat sprite is never touching this green color. The next one is to detect whether two colors are touching each other. So this one is color red is touching color green. I changed the backdrop back to the green, but nothing in the Scratchcat sprite is red, so that's not going to return anything true. So let me run this, and you can see he never says hello because there's nothing red to touch the color green. Now if I stop it, and I'm going to change this using the medicine dropper to be Scratchcat orange, and now run it again. Now he keeps saying hello because Scratchcat is orange and he's touching the color green. The next operator we're going to talk about is one of the ways that you can interact with the users of your code. So this one is if a key is pressed, and you can drop it down and see there's all sorts of different keys in here. I just have it set to the space key. So I run the code, and right now I'm not hitting the space key, so it's not saying hello. If I hit the space key, now he says hello. I let go of the space key, he stops saying hello. The last Boolean sensing block I want to show you is the mouse down operator, and that works pretty much the same way as the key pressed, except for it's whether you have the mouse button pressed down or not. So let me run it. Right now I don't have the mouse pressed down, so it's not saying hello. Now I press it down and he's saying hello. Now let go and he stops saying hello. And this one works for pretty much any of the mouse buttons that you have. Like my mouse has 3 buttons. If I press any of them, it detects that. Moving on to the reporting sensing blocks, the easiest ones to understand are the distance to, mouse X, and mouse Y. So mouse X and mouse Y just reports the current X and Y position of the mouse. And I have a little bit of code set up here that just has Scratchcat say over and over again the current mouse X and Y position. And so as I move my mouse around, it'll keep updating with the new values. So I'm kind of in the middle of the screen here. You can see it's near 0, 0. And as I move away, it changes. And he just always updates and says whatever the current X and Y position are. The distance block shows you the distance to either the mouse pointer or another sprite. So right now I have it at the mouse pointer. As I move my mouse around and get closer to and further from Scratchcat's center, that shows me the distance to it. I can also change this to be the distance to another sprite, and right now neither of my sprites are moving, so it's going to be a static number, but if either of my sprites moved, it would show them. So if I had my code moving Scratchcat around, it would show the different distances as Scratchcat moves around or as this number 8 moves around. There's a few more over here that I'm not going to go through, but you guys can play with them and they're pretty easy to understand. So this one is the loudness of any sounds that are currently playing. This one lets you choose either the stage or any different sprite, and you can choose for the stage with the current backdrop name or number or any variables that are on it. If you choose a sprite, you can have it show you that sprite's X and Y position, its direction, its costume name or number, its size, its volume. So you can get a lot of information about your sprites and your background into your program. You can also get the current year, month, day, day of the week, hour, minute, second, how many days it's been since the year 2000, or the username of the currently logged on user who's using your code. The set drag mode sensing block tells whether your sprite is draggable on the screen by the player or not. So you need to switch into full screen mode to see this, because this is kind of a programming interface. You can always drag your sprites around on here. But in full screen mode, this is what the player sees, and that tells whether they can drag your sprites or not. So if they play, right now Scratchcat is set to be not draggable. I can't drag him around. And the same with the number 8, because not draggable is the default. But if I switch back, change it to be draggable, now my Scratchcat sprite has code in it that says it's draggable. If I switch to my number 8, you can see that there's no code in here, so it's still going to be not draggable. So let's switch back to full screen, play. Now Scratchcat is draggable, but the number 8 is not draggable. The ask and answer sensing blocks are used to get information from the user that you would typically put into a variable and use later in your code, but I'm just going to use a say to show them here. And I'm going to use some the join operator to kind of make the output look a little bit prettier. So let me run my code real quick. It says, what's your name? And I'll say Mr. B. And it says, hello, Mr. B. And then it says, what day is it? And I'll say, today is Monday. So I'll say Monday, and he says, I love Mondays. So it's a real simple way to get information from your user and use it in your code. And the information you get can either be text like I'm doing here, or you can get numbers if you wanted to do something like add 2 numbers together or something. You could ask for the first number and then the second number and add them together. There's one more set of sensing blocks in here, timer and reset timer. We're going to talk about those in a future session just because they're a little more advanced. One last thing about control blocks, which I kind of showed you before, but I wanted to point it out, is that you can put these things within each other over and over again to make really complicated code. So here I have a forever with a repeat inside of it, with an if inside of it, with another if attached to it, and then below it there's another if inside that repeat, and then another repeat inside of it, and another if test inside of it. You can just put this stuff inside each other over and over again. It's called nesting in the computer programming world. This is what can make your code really, really smart, but it also makes it really complicated. So you have to be careful when you do it to not complicate things too much. The last thing I want to do this week is show you some examples I've come up with that make use of some of these more advanced techniques like if tests and looping and operators and sensing that are programs that are a little more advanced than the samples I've been showing you so far. The first example I want to show you is a program that does what's called collision detection. Collision detection is when two things, and in this case it's two sprites, a basketball and a baseball, collide with each other in your program, they do something. So here I'm using the touching edge operator and the touching other sprite operator. So if they touch the edge or they touch another sprite, they do something. And the code in both the sprites look pretty much the same, where if it touches the edge or it touches the other sprite, it moves -10 steps and then picks a new random direction to move in. So let's play it real quick and see what happens. So they start off in a random direction, and when they touch the edge or they touch each other, they bounce. The next example I want to show you is another example of collision detection. This time it detects whether the Scratch Cat sprite is touching the red background. And it does this using the touching color sensing operator. And the way it gets to these is I'm using the distance to mouse pointer operator to have the Scratch Cat move towards my mouse pointer all the time. And what's going to happen is using this if test, when he touches one of these red blocks, he's going to explode. So turn this on, and he starts following my mouse around. Let's have him run into this one down here, and he explodes. The next example is something we had talked about real quickly before, which is a real simple number multiplier. And this shows you an example of how to use the ask and answer sensing blocks to store your answers into variables and then use them later. So in this code, I have variables for the number 1, the number 2, and the result. And what happens is I ask for two numbers, I store those into number 1 and number 2, and then I calculate a result, which is number 1 times number 2, and then I display all that out. So real quick, let's run it. Scratch Cat runs on here, say number 1, we'll put 54, number 2, we'll say 2, 54 times 2 equals 108, and then he goes away. So you can see I'm capturing the answers into variables, I'm capturing the result of an operator into a variable, and then I'm using the joins to print that all out on the screen. Next we have this real simple example that I just wanted to use to show you the concept of nested loops. So here you see I have a repeat 4 and then a repeat 50 inside of it, and all it's going to do is make Scratch Cat look like he's walking in a box. So he walks this way, and that's the first of the repeat 4, then he walks up, that's the second of the repeat 4, then he walks this way, and then inside of it every time it's repeating 50 times, taking 2 steps, waiting a very small amount of time, taking 2 steps, waiting a very small amount of time. So this just is an example of how to do something with their nested loops. The last example I wanted to show you is this old people are dinosaurs again, which we already ran it. I'm not going to do that, but I wanted to show you what the code looked like real quick because it uses a lot of nested ifs. So similarly to some of the others, I'm doing an ask and I'm storing the answer into a variable. Then I test that variable. If the age is less than 5, I switch the costume. Otherwise, if the age is less than 13, I switch the costume. Otherwise, if the age is less than 20, I switch the costume. When it gets back all the way down to the bottom, it says if the costume name of the sprite is cat, then switch the costume to the dinosaur. So what this is doing is the costume by default is cat. If it doesn't get changed in one of these if tests, it goes and changes it down here to be the dinosaur, because if it doesn't get changed in any of these if tests, that means it's over 20 and you're a dinosaur. Alright gang, that's it for week 3. I hope you enjoyed it. Go out and do some coding on your own. Have fun, be creative, and we'll see you next week.